I'm going to share my screen here and get started on a very difficult challenge, which is to talk about an issue that is affecting policing all over the English-speaking world. The issue of race has long been a matter of concern, especially where I grew up in the United States. But in the time since George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, where I'm going next week to see my daughter and her children, that event has had major effects on policing around the world, but I think especially in English-speaking countries, for very good reasons. And those reasons are about the persisting divisions in most English-speaking countries that relate to their past, the past of slavery, the past of colonialism. Many factors are well known to everyone here. But the question is not just understanding the situation, it's also a matter of what to do about it, especially in relation to evidence. And the evidence about policing with respect to racial disparity is extremely important for the resolution and the long-term promotion of harmony and equality among the races in our society. So I'm going to say some things that might be surprising to you, might even be shocking. But before I do that, I'd just like you to know where I'm coming from in relation to these issues. These are my parents back in the 1980s. This is where they were on the 28th of August in 1963, in front of the Washington Monument, looking at the Lincoln Memorial, where Martin Luther King was giving his famous speech on the dream he has that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. King's fight against apartheid in the United States, the prohibition of Black people eating in the same restaurants or staying at the same hotels or shopping in the same stores as white people, was a fact of life when I was growing up in the North, not in the states where I lived, but certainly in the states where Martin Luther King lived. And what he did was to protest in ways that was met with very violent responses by the police that were on television every night. And this is what I grew up with. In 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King led to riots all over the United States. And I think this may have been the point at which I got very interested in policing and the difference that police leadership could make. Because at the time, my parents had just moved out of Washington, D.C., where Patrick V. Murphy was the public safety director. And he called on the police of Washington, D.C. not to shoot looters in stores who were simply taking property. Whereas the mayor of Chicago, Richard J. Daley, was calling on the police in Chicago to shoot the looters and to shoot to kill. And this striking national debate between a police chief wanting to use less force than an elected mayor was a very important turning point in the understanding of the police institution. Certainly for me, when I had the opportunity to work with Patrick Murphy several years later, I jumped at that chance and served in the New York City Police Department while he was the reformed police commissioner, tackling not only issues of police corruption, but also issues of police racism, brutality, and a police force that was killing 93 people a year in a city the size of London. So there were many things about the diversity of American policing, the differences between the reforming police leadership and the defending police leadership that I soon became engaged with and have been reflecting on ever since, especially in the modern current context, post-George Floyd, of thinking about racial disparity in policing. Now, for many people, without reflecting deeply on it, we would see the judgment that if there's any racial disparity in policing, it must be evidence of racism. For others, especially people who care about protecting Black communities, and in this regard, I would include the Friends of George Floyd, who were quoted shortly after his murder as saying the last thing they wanted to do was to abolish the Minneapolis Police Department, which is actually going to go to the voters next Tuesday as a referendum to disband the police department in effect and rename a similar organization, a peace-style department, with a not very clear view of exactly what they will do. But for the people who think about protection and the need for police protection in neighborhoods of high violence, no matter what their racial composition, the racial disparity in policing is not necessarily evidence of racism. In fact, a lack of sufficient protection relative to the risk of violence could be evidence of racism in the other way. And in many parts of the American South during the period of apartheid, Black neighborhoods were abandoned from police patrol, police protection, on the grounds that the white police force was there to protect white people. And it wasn't part of their job to protect Black people. That was certainly present in a number of lawsuits challenging police practices at the time in the 1960s. Now, when we get to the question of murder rates and the extent to which there is equality in the policing of murder, we face a challenge of logic that requires some people to twist some things into place that may not have made sense prior to posing the question. But if the choice is between equal intrusion of policing by race, irrespective of the need for intrusion to prevent violence, if there is equality of intrusion by race at a time when the murder victimization of Black people or other minority groups is far higher than it is for whites, one could argue that that is a form of under-policing that would be racist if you were to look at the consequences of under-policing in relation to higher murder rates. But in order to compensate for those higher murder rates, and indeed to try to drive them down to racial equality of homicide victimization rates, then we are faced with a tragic choice. And not, as many critics of the police would assume, the harmonic situation in which all values can be maximized. All policing can be equal across races at the same time that homicide victimization rates can be equal across races. Well, they haven't been equal in recorded modern times for historical reasons of deprivation and exclusion from employment markets, many other reasons in the English-speaking world for unequal homicide victimization rates. And those reasons weren't caused by police, for the most part. What you see, I think, is the setup here for a logical analysis of what I would call Hippocratic policing, echoing the former Camden County, New Jersey Police Chief J. Scott Thompson, who developed this idea of a Hippocratic oath in policing, which, even though Hippocrates probably never wrote such an oath, as historians tell us, it's certainly well known. And what the oath is about is essentially proportionality in medicine, that you shouldn't inflict more harm on a patient than the harm that you're trying to cure. And similarly, what Thompson said when he took over the Camden City police force that had been disbanded by the state legislature for financial as well as performance reasons, he basically said, you need to make sure that every time you use force, that you are not using any more severe force than the situation you're trying to deal with and the harm that you're trying to prevent. So what does that have to do with the issue of racial disparity in police intrusions into the everyday liberty of people to walk down the street in high crime areas, in low crime areas, in predominantly minority group areas, and in areas that are predominantly non-minority or whites? So in this particular case in Camden, what J. Scott Thompson has pointed out in the discussion of a video that is still widely available on YouTube, what you're seeing with the arrow is a young Black man who has waved a knife at the clerk behind the counter in a fried chicken store and waved the knife at several customers, looking fairly unhappy in relation to his mental health, as the video tracing the entire process, starting with the CCTV inside that restaurant. But under the old regime in Camden County, as soon as the police arrived and he refused to drop the knife, he would have been shot to death, or so Chief Thompson says. Supreme Court of the United States, in a case about people not dropping a knife, has said very explicitly that police have the legal power to shoot to kill anybody who doesn't drop a knife when the police say they should. And if the police think it's important that they drop that knife, in a Supreme Court case, the person with the knife was standing next to their roommate, and the police didn't know whether the roommate was going to get stabbed. As you see this picture, there's not quite as much proximity to somebody. So the legality of shooting them at this point might be debatable, but what's not debatable is that it was against department policy, because the chief said, no, you create a human circle around this person. And the video shows some 20 police officers and several police cars slowly proceeding down the street until finally there comes an opportunity to taser the knife-carrying person, which succeeded, and he dropped the knife, and he was taken into custody completely unharmed. And that is a story that is a counterfactual for the many of the 1,000 times a year that American police kill somebody, disproportionately killing Black people. Racial disparity in police killings of US citizens is a very complex issue. It's also a very rare event in relation to all of the encounters that somewhere close to 1 million police a year have with 330 million Americans. But what I want to stress is that there are many more murders of Black people that are committed in high crime neighborhoods that are arguably not getting sufficient policing. And that rather than staying away from those areas, which might attract criticism of disproportionate or disparate intrusion on the liberties of people of color in those neighborhoods, I am here to argue for a new approach to measurement that would take a different look at this problem. And the evidence that would allow us to have that look is about what matters for racial disparity in policing. As the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Cressida Dick, has said, the fundamental concern of the police around equal protection of law is having equal results for victims. And that if the law fails to protect people of color with the same effectiveness as it protects white people, for whatever reasons that cause crime in society, then that the police must accept and cope with. If the police can't equalize those risks of harm, then they are, by definition, perhaps not providing equal protection of the law. So if we define equal protection of the law in a way that you don't commonly see in law books, But if we say that from a policing standpoint, what we want is equal results for victims, and in theory, even accepting a higher overall victimization rate, as long as it's equal between blacks and whites, as the dream of Martin Luther King might suggest, we have a different kind of issue to resolve than simply this question of whether police use more force against black people than against white people. In the abstract, that sounds like it's wrong. If in the context of trying to equalize the homicide victimization rates, that is a byproduct or a correlate, that would be a very different story. So the question number two about the evidence that we need is whether extra policing for people of color relative to whites is directly responsive to extra risk of high harm, such as murder, for people of color. And sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And by setting that as the criterion, I think we are able to get to the heart of the matter and to distinguish intrusion that is not proportionate to the harm from intrusion that might actually be insufficient in relation to the harm, as opposed to disproportionate, even though strictly on the basis of race, it might be at a higher rate, but on the basis of victimization, it might not be high enough. And that's the core fact that the risk-adjusted disparity index attempts to measure and attempts to produce for the police who are going to start using it in England on January 1st in an attempt to drive down rates of violence in the two worst hotspots in the entire police area, at the same time that they will carefully track the risk-adjusted disparity in stop and search or vehicle stops by race, and whether then the extra policing that is done in those areas where there are disproportionately high numbers of people of color, the question is whether extra policing is then proportionate to the harm. So let's just take those one at a time. If the most important evidence is how we're doing on equal protection of the law, then I would indict the Canadian police, the American police, the British police, the British Home Office for failing to educate the public on just how extreme the difference is in homicide victimization rates. A year ago, when I started working on this, I tried to look up the difference in victimization rates per 1,000 people between white Maori people in New Zealand. And I was not able to find that information. Maybe it's because I'm not a very good web searcher. Maybe if I were a journalist in New Zealand, I would know that that's in the newspaper all the time. If that's the case, I apologize. On the other hand, I couldn't find it in Canada, and I certainly can't find it in the official publications of the US Department of Justice without looking pretty hard. Let's just say that it is not a number that is tracked the way the overall homicide rate is tracked. And with the staggering 30% increase in the homicide rate in the United States, the commentary on that has been about the overall rate. But what we have not seen in the newspapers of record, like the Times or the Washington Post, we haven't seen any breakdown by race. We haven't seen how much of that doubling of homicide in some cities is of Black victims rather than white victims, and how the whole defund the police movement and the attack on police as an institution, how much that has differentially disadvantaged Blacks at risk of being murdered in American cities. Equal protection of the law implies, first of all, that we should achieve equal victimization rates by the most serious crimes, and wouldn't just be murder. It could include rape, it could include robbery or grievous bodily harm. But until we grapple with that question, we can't really look meaningfully at the question of stop and search, because we know that stop and search can be found in frequent use in areas of very high violence. But we also know it can be found in areas with very little violence. In the case of Sandra Bland, who was arrested for a failure to signal while changing lanes and spent 2 nights in jail before she hung herself in a Texas Rangers station where nobody was paying attention to a depressed woman who certainly had access to something to hang herself, which also could be seen in racial disparity terms. But what was more important about it, according to Malcolm Gladwell in his book, Talking to Strangers, was that Sandra Bland had been stopped in a traffic stop and arrested in an area that had not had any violent crime for years. And to be using that kind of intrusion on liberty in an area that didn't have a risk of murder victimization of people of any race really goes to the question of Hippocratic policing. Why are we using stop and search if there is not a risk, a high risk of a harm worse than the intrusion on liberty of somebody who is being stopped and searched? And in hotspots of violent crime, both murder victimization risks and the likelihood of stop and search are disproportionate. But if we look at one of them in isolation from the other, we fail to grasp the key point, which is that the hotspots are different from every other place, just as the racial differences in homicide are quite strikingly varied by the races in question. These are numbers that are buried in the Office of National Statistics in the United Kingdom, and which Sumit Kumar and Heather Strang and I dug out and computed with trend lines to show what we had not been able to find anywhere in a country of 66 million that is arguably the birthplace of English-speaking democracy and rule of law. The fact that at the beginning of this century, Black people were 9 times more likely to be murdered than white people, and the fact that that rate dropped, went back up again, went down again, and actually dropped by about 2/3 by the early part of the second decade. And then by the end of the second decade, the Black homicide victimization rate was going back up again. All the while, if you look at the line at the bottom, with the white homicide rate remaining one of the lowest in the world, and with basically no fluctuations. The Asian rate, which is predominantly South Asian rather than East Asian, has fluctuated a bit, but much closer to the white rate than to the Black rate. And while at least the police commissioner of the metropolis, Cressida Dick, was talking about Black victimization rates, the government wasn't publishing it, nor was the Met publishing the rates for London in a systematic way, which is what we need in evidence-based policing. We need to be systematic. We need to look at trends like this and try to explain them, but also to try to make them the focus of our priorities. Because if we can't protect people equally from homicide, what could be more important than doing that? And what arguably could be more important than focusing resources in a way that does that, rather than consuming huge amounts of police time on extremely low risk events, such as offender absent domestic disturbances, which we've just tested in Britain as something that immediate video conversation with a police officer can produce greater victim satisfaction and reduction of fear than having to wait for a police car to show up, sometimes hours later. So this is a good starting point for all sorts of conversations about resource allocation in policing. But the place that I'd like to go directly to is the use of stop and search. Because while many people say it doesn't work to prevent crime, and they're quite right if you're talking about all crime in all places at all time, that's probably not the right way to ask the question. The way to ask the question is, does stop and search work for what, where, and when? And in 9 out of 9 US studies, quasi-experiments, no randomized trials. But in all of those studies, stop and search is associated with reductions in lethal violence and potentially lethal violence, but only in the hotspot concentrations where that violence occurs. And that's what opens up the possibility for risk-adjusted disparity, which is to say that rather than dividing the number of stops by the number of non-whites in the resident population, the more logical argument is to have the number of intrusions on liberties, such as stop and search, divided by the rate of violent crimes committed against people in an ethnic group in which most of the violent crime, most of the homicide, is intra-racial in character. So that by sending the message that the police are stopping people in an area in which there's lots of violence, and that their stops are no greater than the risk of crime by the race of the people they stop, then what we're doing is coming much closer to a problem that's been around for a long time in understanding the racial disparity in police intrusions into liberty in high crime areas. So if we just look at the population rate of people at home watching television over the age of 50, exploring older people who have very low risks of homicide victimization, in part because we don't get out much, or kids under 5 or 8 who are staying home at night with their parents. Who's out on the streets? A random sample of the population, or in fact, a disproportionate concentration of young males? And that can be true across races, but it can certainly be demonstrated in hotspots of violent crime that are in predominantly minority areas, or at least mixed nighttime economy areas, where you might have substantial portions of both white and non-white populations. Across all of Dorset, which is overwhelmingly rural, with 452 lower super output areas, and only 2 of them getting close to the level of a national hotspot concentration cutoff point, you've got a rate per resident population of 52 Blacks stopped per 1,000 population, compared to a 2.59 for the white population. So it's roughly 5% of the Black population would be stopped under this ratio, compared to 0.2% for the white population. Now, there's a problem here from the very beginning, because Dorset is a resort community and it has very few Blacks who live there. It has a lot of Blacks who visit and come in for the nighttime economy before they take a train back to London or Birmingham or other places that don't have such nice beaches as Bournemouth and Weymouth do. And that's where this experiment is going to be conducted, to see if there can be a way of measuring the rate, that is the likelihood of stop and search, not per 1,000 population, but per 100 violent crimes. So let's look at the difference between looking at the population rate versus the violent crime rate. Across England and Wales, the population-based rate of stop and search is 9 times higher for Black residents of England than for white residents. And so that's a difference of 800% higher likelihood that when Blacks and whites get up in the morning, that the Black person is going to get searched by the police. 800% greater likelihood, which is pretty terrible if you're just looking at the population base. But if you then understand where the searches are being made predominantly, which we don't have good measures on across England, but we do know something about the race of people who are victimized. And as we've seen, the rates are far higher for Blacks than for whites. And so by adjusting on the rate of stop and search per number of homicide victims, instead of having an 800% higher rate, the rate difference drops to 58%, which is itself about 1/16 of the difference of the disparity. So 1.58 to 1 is still a disparity in which Blacks have higher rates of being stopped. But it's certainly not as bad as 800% more. And I think it encourages us to go further, to look at the business of policing hotspots around the world, starting with this wonderful map of Tokyo in the early part of the century, where the three-dimensional portrayal of the risks of violent crimes concentrated around transit stops showed vividly the extreme differences in the likelihood per square foot of violent crime occurring in certain places compared to others. And David Weisberg has written about this law of crime concentration. In 1987, I reported initially that 5% of the addresses in Minneapolis produced 64% of all of the police deployments. And that by failing to deal with these extreme concentrations and to police areas like Tokyo, as the Tokyo police continue to do even after they saw this map, to police all of these areas because crime could happen anywhere. Even though we know it doesn't most of the time, violent crime may not happen for years in these low valleys, these plains of crime-free space across big cities, with the outdoor hotspots being subject to police stop and frisk in many cases. And by doing that, we would see potentially a way of lowering the risk and concentration of violent crime in these areas. But as the police minister for England and Wales said at the Cambridge Evidence-Based Policing Conference in July, hotspots policing is the most evidence-based strategy that has been ignored by the British police and basically not adopted, not implemented, and with very high rates of violence persisting in those areas because arguably they lack even the 15 minutes a day that repeated studies have found can cause major reductions in harm from violent crime in these locations. So Gladwell makes a big issue of that in his book, in which he writes about the work of scholars who have tested stop and search in hotspots. And he tells a very nice story, certainly about my work and David Weisberg's, in which he shows that this is what you have to do in hotspots if you want to drive down the murder rate. But he goes on to make the point, which I probably should have been making for years, which is there's no reason to do it anywhere else, especially considering how intrusive it is. Which brings up the idea from COVID about having tiers of proportionate intrusiveness. When COVID was raising death rates all over England before the vaccines were available about a year ago, the government developed an extensive range of intrusiveness, such as forcing everybody to stay at home. I know people in Australia and New Zealand have been more familiar with this recently. But this was very much a mosaic across England, depending on the local rates of bed occupancy from COVID cases in the National Health Service. So to have the lowest level of restrictions at 1 and the highest level at 5 suggested a kind of tiered proportionality of intrusiveness that could be applied in policing. So if you have a very high homicide rate in a hotspot, you could have very high levels of policing and very high rates of stop and search. And to have the rates of stop and search actually be considered too low in relation to the risk of homicide would be comparable to the judgments made in some of those level 3 areas last November, which the government decided needed to be upgraded to 4 or 5 in order to drive down the death rate. And the death rate from COVID is directly comparable here to the death rate from homicide, because in both cases, there are things that governments can do, there are levers that can be pulled that can make a difference, even though they're intrusive. And then intrusiveness is justified by the proportionality of the benefit from taking liberties away, whether you force people to stay at home or whether you force people to be stopped and searched. So tiered policing at 5% of the places that produce 50% of the serious crime, which would have the stops concentrated there and minimized elsewhere, and basically without very documented reasons, such as a number plate that's being associated with a serious crime, absent that kind of direct evidence that you would not be using stop and search routinely the way it's used in high crime areas. Would that be a proportionate response? Well, suppose you're in a hotspot and you see somebody who may have a bulge or some other articulable suspicion about they may have a violent crime possibility because they might have a weapon concealed on them. So you could say to that person, well, there's been a lot of violent crime around here lately, so we're asking people to help by letting police ensure that no one is carrying concealed weapons. I've seen officers say that in high crime hotspots. It's generally well received by the people they're searching because it begins by an expression of concern for their safety. That's the whole implicit basis. We're doing this for you. So give us a hand and just let us give you a quick search or frisk on the outside. But suppose you came up to people, as you would have to in most of Dorset, which has basically no violent crime, but it's got plenty of stop and search spread out across that county. Why? Because there's never been a clear focus on using it for violent crime as distinct from, fighting the war on drugs and finding marijuana cigarettes in most people's pockets. If you say there's been very little violent crime around here for a long time and we want to keep it that way, so get out of the car, that doesn't sound very Hippocratic. Doesn't sound very proportionate. And I think the justification with respect to the violent crime risk that people who are in a hotspot, especially a nighttime economy hotspot, that justification can strengthen the legitimacy of what the police are doing. And so it all depends then on the evidence of whether the effects of stops in hotspots reduce the risk of murder and other serious victimization. And in that regard, the UK has chosen to take the path of ignorance because there's not been a single test of stop and search with proper controls. And so in January, Dorset is planning to launch a randomized controlled trial with alternating days in the two hotspots where there'd be very high levels of stop and search on some days and basically no stop and search on other days. And this research is being undertaken by a succession of chief constables who've been working on planning it with us at Cambridge, because it has the ring of clarity that they have lacked in trying to explain why their stop and search rates are so much higher based on population. And by developing the RAD index as a way of seeing if even more stop and search in these neighborhoods can't be creating an equal risk per crime of stop and search by race, they're building on the two reports of the National Academy of Sciences that look at the benefits of hotspot policing, but more importantly, that look at issues of proactive engagement with Black people in high crime neighborhoods, in which the National Academy of Sciences, founded by Abraham Lincoln, located in Washington, D.C., issued a report first on the fairness and effectiveness of policing, the evidence. In 2004, Wes Scogan and his study director at the National Academy of Sciences had a whole chapter in which there's massive discussion of what is the relevant denominator for racial disparity in stop and search. And in this report, it was clearly argued that the relevant denominator is not the resident population, which is what Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary has been beating up the Dorset police on, and indeed every other police force, because resident population seems to be the default approach. But back in 2004, this report said, no, it's not the resident population, it's the street population, which is hard to measure, especially since most of the stops occur at high crime times, on high crime days, in high crime places. And to get fair measurement of those street populations is difficult. Now, some people have done it, and they found that there's still a disparity nonetheless. Others who have tried it with systematic observation have found that there's no disparity, such as a study in Reading in England. In the second report in 2018, there's an even more important finding. And the key question is whether such proactive policing as stop and search reduces violence. And the answer is yes, in hotspots. This is the quote from conclusion 4.9 in the 2018 report. Evaluations of focused uses of stop, question, and frisk, SQF, combined with other self-initiated enforcement activities by officers, targeting places with violence or serious gun crimes and focusing on high-risk repeat offenders, consistently report short-term crime reduction effects. Consistently is right. This is the first of the studies, published in 1995, conducted in the early 90s in Kansas City, Missouri, in which a federal grant was used to massively increase the amount of proactive policing in the #1 gun crime beat, with a homicide rate of 180 per 100,000 population, which is roughly 20 times higher than the national average homicide rate at the time. And in that target beat, the gun crimes went down by 49%, while gun seizures were almost doubled, and proactive engagement by the police every 40 minutes per unit was raising the risk of anybody being stopped by the police in these areas substantially. As an aside, I'll say that while most of the people stopped in those areas were the same race as the residents, overwhelmingly Black, direct observation by James Shaw showed that if a white person appeared, their stop rate was 100%. So they thought white people were out of place. They were probably looking for drugs, and for whatever reasons, even in a majority Black area, this was possible to have a higher certainty of white people being stopped and searched for the contextual reasons. In comparison to a very high gun crime beat several miles away, there was no change in the gun crimes, and there was no change in proactive policing. Subsequent studies replicated that finding in Pittsburgh and Indianapolis, and this was the national trend going on about the same time. When the weapons arrests went up, clearly the police were looking for more weapons, and as soon as they did that, the homicide rates started plunging. And for the better part of the next decade, well into the 21st century, homicide rates in the United States went down. And that was before last year, when they turned around and started to soar. But we still don't know what the weapons arrests, what the stop and search, what the hotspots patrols were in those big cities, and whether it was the absence of the perception of certainty that changed it. We don't know. But what we do know is that, and I'll try to wrap this up so there's some time for questions, we do know that with stop and search, there is at least enough evidence to suggest it could be the key. In fact, it could be an essential ingredient in producing racial equality in victimization rates for homicide. And the hypothesis would be that if and only if stops are targeted in places with high levels of weapons violence, that is what Gladwell would say, the stops are coupled to high risk of serious crime, then they will, on average, deter carrying of concealed weapons, knives or guns, although most of this evidence does relate to guns, which is certainly a distinctly American problem in the first or global North world. But it could also deter carrying of concealed weapons of other description, including knives. And that could lead to reductions in assaults and murders with weapons and lethal consequences that could ultimately level the rates of violence by race. Which then brings up the third point, and that is, even if we drive down the homicide rates, if we do so in a way that is racially inequitable, that the burden of stop and search is greater for Black people than it is for whites relative to the risk of victimization, then that would be a hollow victory, one that might be avoided by developing this new Cambridge tool called the Risk Adjusted Disparity Index, the RAD index. And what the RAD index does is to compute the rate of stop and search per violent act, not based on the resident population, including infants and older people who are staying at home, but actually the risk of victimization on the streets. And so the victimization reports, if they are kept properly by race of victim, and actually that's failing in record keeping in many British police forces because nobody is checking relentlessly to make sure that the race of the victim is entered on the criminal offense report. But if that happens and we can reliably compute the victimization rate by race, we don't need to know who lives where. We just need to know that in this area, this is the number of Black people who were victimized by homicide. This is the number of white people who were victimized not only by homicide, but also robbery at knife point or rape or grievous bodily harm, other serious crimes. And the count of those crimes becomes the denominator, the indicator of how much crime there is against people by race on those streets. And the numerator that's put on top of it is the number of stop and searches. So what we're driving for is to have the ratio of stop and searches to the number of crimes be equal by population. If you increase stop and searches, but you do it equal to the risk of victimization, then that's a way to create higher rates of stop and search that might drive down the violent crime, but also create equality of the ratio of stops to the risk that people in different races are experiencing in this area, and just in this area. And to be area specific, I think, helps to use this information as an indicator of the street population's demography and the race of the people on the same streets linked to these small areas, which in the UK are called LSOAs. So this is what it looks like as a fraction. It's the idea of police actions of any kind, but call it stop and search, or it could be vehicle stops, whatever it might be. The police actions are the numerator. The criminal victimizations by race are the denominator. And you do that for each race. So it's done twice when you have two races. You divide the stops of whites by the number of serious violent crimes against whites, SVC for serious violent crime. Call that X. Then you do the same calculation for non-whites. Number of stops of non-whites divided by the number of serious violent crimes against non-whites, and call that Y. And then you divide the Y by the X, which equals Z, which would be the RAD index score. And if it's 1, then you're neither over-policing nor under-policing. If, for example, you had many fewer stops per Black victims, that would be seen as under-policing, or arguably over-policing of whites, and potentially vice versa. So the key point here is to look at current victimizations by race with both the resident and non-resident population. We don't care where they live. What we care about is, were they subjected to a violent crime in this hotspot? And we can do this up to date every week. And that's the plan endorses, to look at the RAD index for each of these hotspots where there's extra stop and search being used on certain days and not others. And so without worrying about the census in a beach resort community, without worrying about these calculations based on the census, what we could do is to look at tracking of the RAD index with feedback, and using good measurement and good local leadership, with the sergeant discussing with the constables what the RAD index has been for stop and search. At the same time that I might stress, we're talking about increasing the number of stop and searches in these under-policed areas with far higher crime harm index values than the rest of Dorset. And that recent discussions with the former chief constables indicate that they now think, in retrospect, they under-policed those areas simply because of the well-established pattern of providing police in relation to population rather than in relation to crime harm index scores. So getting a hold of these things is difficult because it shakes up a lot of the status quo about how resources are allocated. But I should just close by stressing with two separate questions. We don't know how many stops it's needed are needed to drive down serious violent crime. You can find that out, I think, by trial and error. But even if you had violent crime go up, you might still achieve equality by race, because the rate of stops per 100 serious violent crimes may depend very much on the way in which discretion is used to stop people, and that can be managed with tracking and feedback. So no matter what the ratio is, the RAD can compute the ratio of ratios between whites and blacks, 77 stops per 100 serious crimes across all of England in 2019, 7 stops per, we could say hypothetically, if there's 7 stops per 100 serious crimes against whites and 70 stops per 100 serious crimes against non-whites, then there would be a very unfair RAD index of 10 to 1. So it's still 10 times more likely that blacks are stopped. But if we create a ratio of 1 to 1, as in these examples, then I think we have a legitimate response to a complaint that there might be more stops per population for one race than another, but that the equality in relation to victimization is well established. And that balanced policing of the RAD index equaling 1.0 can be viewed as a metric of over-policing or imbalanced policing, balanced versus imbalanced, and to target the places where the stops are occurring, where the violent crime is occurring, where the risk-adjusted disparity may be highest, and in fact, where the race of victim might even be underreported. All of these things are complicated, but they're feasible. And the biggest caveat is to focus on places and do this within hotspots rather than trying to take in an entire jurisdiction, which is what's been hurting the British police and keeping them away from the dream that we can now adopt for the 21st century of trying to achieve not only equal policing, but equal consequences of policing for equal death rates from murder. And that is a dream I would hope we can all work together to achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sherman, for that presentation. We really do appreciate it. And the information that you have provided has caused a number of people to put questions through. So thank you for giving time to that. And hopefully you're okay if I post some of the questions on behalf of the audience now. And also, I did want to mention, I didn't mention it in the introduction to you, Professor Sherman, but I understand that in the last few days you have been granted British citizenship as well. So congratulations to you on that. I thought I'd make mention of that. Let's go to some questions now, if that's okay. The first says that according to Ministry of Justice conviction data here in New Zealand, 60% of Māori males born in 1978 had at least one criminal conviction by the age of 38, in comparison to 33% of Pākehā European males had at least one conviction. What is the one evidence-based piece of research you would recommend be undertaken to address this?
I think the way in which those convictions have occurred needs to be examined to understand related numbers, such as the pointing of tasers at blacks versus whites in the UK. And in both cases, you're looking very often at a conflict in a community that led to calling the police and that led to various decisions that were made by members of the community as well as by the police and ultimately prosecutors to use the enforcement of the law for its own sake, as opposed to using the discretion in English law since 1361, which has a two-pronged test. The first is there evidence that the law was broken? And the second is it in the public interest to enforce the law? And what we have learned in many diversion from prosecution studies is that if we offer both whites and blacks the opportunity to avoid prosecution if they will cooperate with a pre-prosecution rehabilitation program. There is substantial evidence that minorities will benefit more from that, and that their future criminal careers will be stopped with the first offense, as opposed to prolonged, because once you get caught in the system, it tends to keep pulling further processing through the system. So perhaps the best answer to your one study would be to conduct the equivalent of the Birmingham Turning Point experiment. What we did in Birmingham is well known to Simon Williams in the Evidence-Based Policing Center in New Zealand, and he'd be happy to tell people in the Australian context as well that this plan, which is now being replicated in a number of police forces across Britain to encourage out-of-court disposal, may well be the most immediate means of reducing racial disparity in conviction rates and incarceration rates. And the incarceration disparity for Blacks in the UK relative to whites is higher than it is in the US. And it's very high in the US. So it's striking that it's so much higher in the UK. And it's all the more reason that the police at the front end of the system would experiment in every possible way to reduce prosecution and at the same time potentially reduce crime. And certainly with the accumulating evidence that the more you prosecute first offenders, the more crime they committed, then the public interest test of whether you should be prosecuting these people as opposed to diverting them to alcohol or drug abuse treatment or literacy or God knows what might work better. But there's been lots of diverse ways of helping people to reform and to go straight with the law rather than sending them down a fairly unsuccessful pathway of prosecution, as the experimental evidence shows.
Thank you for that point, Larry. I'm just looking at Simon as you mentioned the Birmingham Turning Point. So it's been noted and he's nodding his head at me now. So thank you for that. The next question asks, what does the composition of extra policing for extra harm look like in practice? Is it things like community policing, gang suppression units, prevention strategies, enforcement focus, or a combination of all depending on the crime type?
Well, these are great questions, and the best way to answer them would be controlled experiments in which you might look at these things one at a time, and you could randomly assign in the same places on different days over a long enough period of time some of the things that are day specific, like how many minutes in the hotspot did a police car spend, with the Perth study showing about 14 minutes of time in one hotspot lasted up to 4 days in terms of suppressing very high levels of harm that went up after 4 days. But to just have the police car or the police bicycle present in the hotspot for 14, 15 minutes has been replicated now in England in a number of places. And so simply being there, not doing stop and search, not necessarily even talking to people as much as just being there, has made a difference in some places. But other ways of engaging with the population, community policing, yes, or potentially being on the lookout for people who are wanted on arrest warrants. They've failed to appear in court, or other ways of not only identifying the potential people who are high risk of high harm, but also rank ordering. And so just to say that somebody's wanted on a warrant isn't, in my book, sufficient reason to go out and try to drag them off the streets and back into the court process. If, on the other hand, this is a person who is wanted for an attempted murder or for a rape with very high crime harm index values, then I would think that's the kind of person that could be prioritized in the hotspots, which would have the additional impact on police interest in hotspots policing, which has not been huge, in part because if there's no crime, that's actually what we want to achieve, but it's not very interesting. So it turns the police into a sentinel role rather than people who are successful at catching somebody who's quite dangerous and taking them off the street. And since the death of Sarah Everard in England, we're increasingly interested in that. And I'm trying to promote the research on covert surveillance of extremely dangerous people who have come out of prison or who might be fugitives, but using very high-end and intrusive techniques on very, very dangerous people, and being very clear that that's what we do with very dangerous people, but we don't do it with anybody else, and we don't do it in places that are place-based policing, but don't have enough crime in the place to justify that. I think that's where the Hippocratic policing, that's where the proportionality really has to be taken with a quantitative bent, and using the crime harm index for places for victims and for offenders is the key to evidence-based policing. And I'm not sure that people who are interested in evidence-based policing are as interested in those dimensions of it. But I can't think of anything more important for setting priorities and for protecting the community as well as the rule of law than a proportionate ranking of who, where, and when the police need to spend time doing lots of different things that could be tested and compared. But the basic decision is to put the resources where the harm is.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, Professor Sherman. Our next question asks, what should extra protection look like? The person posting the question says that they would suggest this goes beyond more policing in a traditional sense in areas that need more protection, to include addressing the vulnerabilities within these areas or communities.
The vulnerability issue is extremely important. And in discussions in India 2 weeks ago at the National Police Academy, they proposed that an Indian crime harm index actually increase the severity score of each crime type by 50% if the victim is a female, or potentially a child under 10 or an elderly person over 70. And this idea of calibrating harm around vulnerability of the victim and not just around the intrinsic severity of the crime is actually written into criminal law in a number of categories in England and Wales, and I think in other countries. So this question of how you police to protect the vulnerable has a very long path coming out of a victim focus of targeting high harm victims, which Dorset did for the first time, any police force, looking at over 30,000 victims in 1 year, 2016, and looking at the distribution of harm across those victims. And they found that less than 4% of the victims produced 85% of the harm severity. And those victims were not on their radar screen before they did that rank ordering analysis. And since they have done that and can now do it annually and potentially more often, they're changing the way in which they prioritize the safeguarding units and indeed problem-oriented policing around these high harm victims who some of whom have a single victimization, but many of them had 4 or 5 very serious crimes committed against them for reasons that might be due to family or neighborhood context. But certainly it challenges policing to think in new ways about what would work with such incredibly high concentrations of harm against a single individual. And that's just as important, if not more important, than looking at the harm caused by a single individual. In fact, the biggest finding from evidence-based policing about people is the huge overlap of victim experience and offending experience. So the highest harm individuals are people who have been both victims and offenders. And that's a very good place to start for looking for vulnerable people, because even offenders can be very vulnerable.
Thank you. Thank you for that point. And for that answer as well. And thank you to all those who are asking questions. We've got time for one more, Professor Sherman, if that's okay. The last question is, what is the reason for the reluctance of forces to adopt hotspot policing? The questioner says we deployed a solution to help the tasking and monitoring of hotspot policing, which had the impact that you're describing. But 14 years on, very little adoption in UK policing.
Yes, I think this is a kind of circular or vicious circle, I guess, because what happens when you just tell police to do hotspots policing without explaining why, without dealing with their unspoken objections that, oh, that'll just push crime around the corner, and even more so their assumption that the only way you deter police is to have an officer present And as soon as the officer leaves, then the crime's going to start. Actually, residual deterrence, that leftover effect of police presence, is huge. And in the London Underground study, we found that 97% of all of the crime prevention in the platforms targeted for patrols 4 days a week. And so 3 days a week, there were no patrols at all, but there was still much less crime on those platforms than on platforms that did not have any regular foot patrols during the 4 days a week. So if 97% of the crime prevention effective patrol takes place when the police are not there, I know lots of constables who A, wouldn't believe it, and B, if they sat through a couple days training and discussion, might actually change their minds when they see all the evidence, especially the evidence against displacement of just pushing the crime around the corner. But I don't think that the objection of rank and file officers to doing hotspots policing is insurmountable. I think actually more to the point, it's proof of the need for evidence-based policing to be delivered at every rank level in every role in policing. It's not just something for the leadership in headquarters to send down orders, say, go police this hotspot, go police that hotspot. It's got to be a transformation in comprehension. It's like trying to teach doctors how to do surgery without giving them explanations about the biochemistry of the incisions and other things that they're doing. Sure, they can cut and sew, but if they don't understand the larger context of how that surgery works, then they're probably not the surgeon I would want to have, I can tell you. I want police to understand the theory and evidence behind policing. And if we can create an evidence-based culture from recruit school right through retirement, where everybody's constantly looking for new evidence about how to do policing better, and they understand that evidence from the very beginning of their careers, I think we could have much more widespread adoption of hotspots policing and other effective strategies that are currently resisted because they're just not understood and they're not presented as part of a professional knowledge base, which is essential for being a good police officer.